like to discuss in, they say Christian circles, and it's probably not something your grandma would approve of discussing in a Bible study, and then it says, sorry, Granny. So it's kind of a heavy topic, but I didn't think that it would, like, speak to me as much as it did, I guess, like, when I chose it. So in chapter 31, Jacob decides to pack up his family and herds and leave the city and go to a different area. So Laban was upset when he found out that they left in secret, but he and Jacob eventually parted ways on good terms. And then in chapter 32, Jacob prepares to reunite with his brother, Esau is how I think you pronounce it, as they prepared to pass into, like, his territory. And this is what, like, originally got Jacob worried, and kind of is the basis for the rest of the story. So through this, Jacob remembered that his brother had a lot of anger against him, and therefore asked God to keep him safe, like, as he traveled with his family and his herds. Jacob decided to make this, like, elaborate plan to try to appease his brother and split up his family, so that they could interact in, like, a non-hostile way. So when Jacob was alone, he wrestled with God quite literally and asked him for a blessing so that he could continue on with this journey. In chapter 33, Jacob finally meets up with his brother, and instead of being welcomed in the way that Jacob thought he would be, he was welcomed in a way that he never thought, like, would happen. Esau welcomed Jacob with open arms and not angry like he expected him to be, therefore making, like, all of his anxious preparations seem all for naught. And then in chapters 34 and 35, Jacob ends up settling again down with his family, and then God helps Jacob and his family purify themselves and reaffirm his covenant with Jacob and himself. So on page 153, they actually focus on chapter 32 specifically and just the 10 verses of 22 through 32. So I just wanted to read that if you wanted to follow along. In the Bible, it's just titled, the section is titled, Jacob Wrestles with God. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob said, Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him, and he passed Peniel limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So that's, like, the verses that this chapter kind of focuses on. So they start off in the book with asking about, like, has anyone ever struggled with doubt? And this chapter can basically be summed up with the struggle with doubt, questioning, and, like, everything that has to do with, like, not trusting the Lord to your fullest. So they start off with reminding us of the story of Thomas, which is in the book of John. So John 20:25 says, kind of questions Thomas's faith in Jesus, because he asked to see the nail marks in Jesus's hands before he can fully, like, admit to himself and others that he believes in him. So John 20:25 says, "But he said to him, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." So they go on to say that we're kind of taught this story like of Thomas and as a cautionary tale, because like in a sense we're not supposed to be doubting like him. We're supposed to be we're supposed to be like those blessed people who believe without seeing. But then it kind of questions us into what do we do if we are Thomas? So like, what do we do in our moments in which we are Thomas? So it says we might all be scared of Thomas's doubt. We might all use it as a horror story, something to scare away those doubters. But Jesus met Thomas in his questioning and gave him exactly what he needed, and he will do the same for us. So they say that the alternative title for this chapter would be God Pro Wrestler, as we see like in the story of Jacob. So to get into like the story in Genesis, Jacob during this time was yet again like in a bit of a issue. He escaped the city in the dead of the night. He took his family. He took his herds. He left nothing for anyone else, because he heard from the Lord in a dream that this is what he was supposed to do, and head back to the land of his family. However, he quickly figured out that kind of the grass wasn't greener on the other side as he thought, and he wasn't able to do it alone. So because of this, Jacob was terrified that, again, his brother was still mad about past happenings, and was kind of unsure about how he would be treated once he got back. So because of this, in Genesis 32:9, Jacob prayed. So Jacob begins to ask God for guidance, but it seems to be as though he did that as an afterthought and not as like his first decision. He was so caught up in like this frantic planning of how he planned to do things and his like plan for what he was supposed to do, that talking to the Lord was just like not the top priority. So because of this, we could say that Jacob was the doubter. So this is at the bottom of 155. Just like he did with Thomas, God knew exactly what Jacob needed. So because of this, God wanted Jacob to be alone, like for this one-on-one encounter that he was about to have, that would change like the trajectory of his life. So Genesis 32:24 says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. So Jacob and God were wrestling, and the Bible says that God saw that he could not overpower him. So on 157, they kind of have like an explanation of this verse. So we know that God could overpower Jacob because God is all powerful. And we even see that he, through the verses that we just read, dislocated Jacob's hip with a touch in the same verse. So why did the author even add the couldn't overpower him part? Through this kind of emphasis on the fact that Jacob was left alone supports the idea that Jacob was had a very persistent personality. Therefore, Jacob was quite literally on the ground with God, wrestling for his life in a sense. And Jacob would not give up. So when we wrestle with doubts or questions, which kind of leads to the moral of this week's story, is that for some of us, our temptation could be just to give up. Just to throw in the towel, just to say it's not worth it, just to say, I'm not willing to do this anymore. I'm just going to leave it where it is and not continue. So it says, how many friends do you have who used to be Christians, but they encountered a hard place and decided that maybe this faith wasn't for them? In this area, we're called to be like Jacob, to keep wrestling through the night even when it doesn't make sense. So if we think about it in a different sense, Jacob thought he could win. In his kind of fleshly beliefs and desires, he thought that he could win. He wanted to push through this situation to have some sort of victory over God. In a sense, he wanted to be right. So because of this, we can kind of ask ourselves, why did God allow this to continue? Why didn't he stop it before it got a good start? And on page 157, they just sum it up with the sentence that there must have been purpose in the struggle. So if we fast forward, Jacob wasn't going to leave like this altercation with God and like this fight literally like on the ground without a blessing. He specifically asked God to bless him because he said, I will not let you go until you bless me. So Jacob recognized that this man that he was wrestling was more than a human. He didn't want to leave empty-handed. He kind of knew that there was like something more for him. So Jacob wrestled, after wrestling so hard like with this battle, he decided that he was at the point where all he could do was hold on to the Lord with everything that he had. So the book of Hosea actually gives us kind of like a history about Jacob's name. Hosea 12:3-4 says, in the womb he grasped his brother's heel. As a man he struggled with God. He struggled with the angel and overcame him. He wept and begged for his favor. So this kind of helps us like imagine the situation that Jacob was in with God and how he kind of reacted kind of in the moment. So on page 158 it says, we can imagine the moment when Jacob asked the Lord for this blessing. He was desperate, he was crying, he was in need. But again, Jacob would not like submit to what the Lord had for him. So that's when the Lord dislocated his hip, and God met him there, staring into Jacob's tear-filled eyes, and spoke to him like in this instance. So Jacob's name before it was changed means heel grasper, and in this context, it implies that he was like a trickster. He was doomed to grasping for things, never quite the first to succeed, always having to scheme his way to the top. But it was in the moment that Jacob and God were alone, and when God asked him who he was or who his name was, that Jacob was forced to face his reality. So regarding ourselves, what about like us in general? Has God ever gotten you alone and looked you in the eyes and asked you to face it? To like face your doubts, to face your concerns, to face your questions. So, this kind of like wrestling with all of these kind of doubts and these questions and these concerns is in a sense like our kind of Jacob situation. Jacob was so preoccupied in this situation with meeting his brother that God had called him to go home and told him he would be blessed because of it. But Jacob wasn't so sure if God would actually stick to his word. So on page 161, Jacob thought that his brother was the enemy, but in reality, the enemy was himself. So Jacob was fighting with himself, therefore God had to conquer him. It says the reality is when we wrestle with God, winning cannot be our end goal. So when we encounter hard things that we need to struggle through with the Lord, the act of overcoming kind of looks different. So it says when we go head to head with God, we have to lose. And that kind of stuck out to me, I guess, like as I was preparing like with this chapter, is what it says in the next paragraph. If everything was so clear and so easy and so kind of like nonchalant in life and kind of just moving through with no issues, we would have no reason to have faith. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway, I guess, that I had. Because it is in the struggle that we as God's people get the chance to become face to face with God. So it's in the struggle when we really get to know who he is. And then we find our victory in the submission to both his will and his goodness. And Jacob learned this lesson too, through his story. So Jacob, who was once known as the trickster, once known as like the heel grasper, like he just had to cheat his way to the top. He was quite literally at like, it says rock bottom in the dirt, but like the bottom of the barrel in a sense with God. It was only him and his father. So in a sense, this is exactly what God had planned for him in order to redeem Jacob and do his best work through him. And then this kind of leads to the time in which Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So Israel had just looked God in the face, becoming personal with the Father, begging him for help in his struggle. But Jacob, now Israel, knew who that man was. But God didn't. It says God could have told him outright who he was. He could have pulled out the I am moment that he uses with Moses and be like, I'm God, duh. But that wouldn't have made it any easier for Israel. God didn't confirm. God didn't clarify. He challenged him to rely on his faith, and then he blessed him because of it. So kind of to sum this up a little, through like Jacob's story, he had this radical encounter with God, and ever since then, like those radical encounters, you can't leave those unchanged as a person. So Israel didn't need God's like huge express confirmation to know that he was there, because he relied on his faith. So he knew that God, through faith, had just met him where he was. He knew that God, in his mercy, had allowed him to go through this struggle and allowed him to lose with like a bigger plan in mind. So at this point in time, Israel meets his brother Esau, and it actually goes in the direct opposite way that he planned for. So on page 164, it says Esau greeted him with a hug. So the Bible tells us that Jacob and Israel walk away from this God encounter with a limp. And it's similar to Thomas's story. So Thomas needed to see to believe. He really wasn't like going to believe it through faith. He wasn't going to trust that like that was the reality without actually seeing it physically for himself. So Jesus showed up and held out his hands and allowed Thomas to touch him. So when God did kind of the same thing with Israel, he kind of did it in a different manner. He still gave him a memory, but that memory was through the limp, as a result of the thing that God did to his hip. However, that limp was kind of a tangible reminder of God, his realness, his closeness, and his power. So we know that God meets us in our struggle, isn't scared of our doubts, but we also know that he challenges us to rely on our faith, therefore choosing to believe like when we can't see. So on page 165, it says Jesus wrestled with Israel and allowed him to walk away with a limp. God will show up for you in your struggle too. When you are weighed down by doubts, questions, and spiritual insecurity, look for your limp. Choose faith even when you are in the midst of an all-night wrestling match with your Creator. He might just look you in the eyes and give you a new name. So that was like this week's story, I guess, in a nutshell. There's 3 questions.